In 10 years, over 3,000 Falun Gong practitioners are confirmed dead, killed from torture and abuse in custody.
This is really serious. This is an evil crime.
We're looking at genocide in China. We're looking at one of the biggest crimes against humanity in modern history.
This number comes from phone calls and emails from family and friends of the dead. Their stories are compiled by Falun Gong volunteers and hosted on an online database. But this number is only part of the story. Many people disappeared after the persecution began, sent to prisons on catch-all crimes like endangering national security, or sent to labor camps and black jails without the formality of a trial. 3 years ago, a handful of people believed they knew what had happened to the people who disappeared.
And who were they? And where did they take them, or where did they die? Because in my mind, they're dead.
What happened to the disappeared? They, as far as we know, they're still there in these camps. Many of them been killed through organ harvesting, but the rest are still there, and they're the organ data bank for China.
This program attempts to shed light on an investigation the Chinese government doesn't want you to know about. An investigation into alleged organ murder in the world's #3 economy.
This is a form of evil we have yet to see on this planet. This is a new form of evil.
My family was just me, my mom, and my grandma.
Now 21, Chen Tong was born in northeast China's Weifang City. After gaining refugee status in the US, he now works the 3rd shift at this printing press in New Jersey.
My family learned about Falun Gong through a friend, and I began practicing with my grandmother and mother.
10 years ago, Chen was 11 years old when the campaign against Falun Gong began.
Beginning on July 20th, 1999, and ever since then, I felt that my destiny had changed. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, began persecuting Falun Gong. Afterwards, for about 10 years now, my family has been broken up. My mom got arrested 6 times, and I got arrested twice when I was 11, along with my family.
Chen's family appealed for Falun Gong in Beijing and was punished. In 1999, his grandmother was taken into custody. He never saw her again.
For a long time, after my grandmother was persecuted to death, I was not aware that she had died. It was by chance that I heard about it during a family conversation. I was very upset at the time, because my grandma raised me since I was little. I was in a lot of pain. After I turned 12, I was separated from my mother. After that, police went to speak to my teacher at school, asking for me to be expelled. The teacher kept looking for me, and I was forced to quit school. I continued to be homeless for 6 years after that. I've not seen my mother since the beginning of 2004. Back then, I was just trying to keep from getting arrested by the Chinese police. But at the time, even though I didn't have a stable place to live, compared to the other Falun Gong practitioners in China who were being held by the CCP, I still felt I was in a much better place. At that time, we always clarified the truth to the Chinese people.
Chen was eventually taken into custody but was later released without being physically harmed. With help from other Falun Gong practitioners, he made it to Thailand before gaining refugee status in the US. Relatively few Falun Gong practitioners have made it out of China. The Laogai Research Foundation estimates that there are currently anywhere from 3 to 5 million people imprisoned in China's labor camps, prisons, and detention centers.
People over in China come over and take pictures.
Ethan Gutman estimates that around 800,000 of them are Falun Gong. From the beginning, practitioners have reported being physically, mentally, and sexually abused in the process of being transformed. But it wasn't until 2006 that 2 witnesses stepped forward and claimed that some practitioners were being murdered for their organs, to meet the demands of China's booming transplantation industry. The allegations and subsequent investigation have been dismissed by the Chinese government. But a handful of people have dedicated themselves to publicizing the evidence around the world. This is their story. In 2006, the Epoch Times newspaper published interviews with 2 Chinese expats identified only as Annie and Peter. Annie claimed that her husband had been harvesting organs from Falun Gong practitioners at this hospital in northeast China's Shenyang city. Peter likewise claimed he had investigated the story for a Japanese newspaper. The Epoch Times later published a 3rd interview with an unidentified military doctor, who confirmed the story. But when U.S. officials visited the main hospital in question, they didn't find anything unusual.
What happened at Sujitan is really still a completely open question. The fact that they didn't find anything didn't really prove anything. I mean, by Chinese construction standards, they were there 3 weeks later. Who knows? There's a million ways to sort of fill in the cracks by then.
But the allegation itself was difficult to believe, and the theatrics that surrounded the story didn't help. On one clear spring day in Washington, while Annie and Peter told their stories at a Falun Gong rally in McPherson Square, a couple blocks away, Dr. Wenyi Wang interrupted an official visit by the Chinese president, shouting at former U.S. President Bush to stop him from killing.
This was a huge problem in the way Falun Gong presented it. They presented it as a big, shocking revelation, whereas in fact they should have said, well, this is a big, shocking revelation, but you know what? It's hardly surprising.
Hardly surprising, because Caijing magazine and the South China Morning Post reported that over 90% of donor organs come from executed prisoners. Hardly surprising, because UN Special Rapporteur Manfred Nowak estimated in 2005 that Falun Gong made up half of China's labor camp population, and that torture was widespread. Hardly surprising, yet impossible to believe, and the mainstream media were reluctant to report it. But a couple months later, the story was back in the news with the publication of the Bloody Harvest Report.
Our bottom line conclusion, after considering everything as best we could, was that the allegations are true. We believe them to be true, that this harvesting is indeed happening. That conclusion comes not from any one of these different 18 categories of evidence that we looked at, but by assessing everything all together. Altogether, they paint a whole picture.
Written by a human rights lawyer, David Matus, and a retired Canadian politician, David Kilgore. The original report listed 18 areas of evidence. It was later revised to include a total of 33 areas of evidence. At the center of it all was a number.
We estimate that in the period between 2000 and 2005, there are 41,500 transplants which have no other explained source.
The number was based on one simple calculation: that the number of organ transplants in China seemed to have multiplied after the persecution of Falun Gong began, with no new source of organs. But there was a problem. The numbers were squishy. China doesn't publish the total number of executions or transplants. For executions, Kilgore Mattis used Amnesty's figures of confirmed executions, but other estimates range from 5,000 to 12,000 executions a year, or 7 to 18 times the rest of the world combined in 2008. For the total number of transplants, Kilgore Mattis quoted Shi Bingyi, the executive deputy director of the organ transplant branch of the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences. In 2006, the Jiankang or Health Daily website quoted Shi as saying that around 90,000 transplants had been performed in China as of 2005. But in the documentary Re-Examining the Davids Report, produced by Hong Kong-based Phoenix TV, Shi denied making such claims.
我没有说过这样的话，为什么？因为我头脑里就没有这样的数字，我没有过非常详细的调查哪一个时间段是多少例，我们没有这样的数字，所以我也不可能说。
Shi's quote can still be found in an archived version of the Jiankang or Health Daily website. In their 2007 response to a United Nations inquiry into organ harvesting, the Chinese government stated, "To date, no Chinese authority has compiled official statistics on organ transplants between the years 2000 and 2005. And that, given the above situation, the so-called discrepancy referred to in the communication that we have received does not make sense." But this report, published by the World Health Organization, tells a different story. The report is a summary of a meeting of government authorities from different Asia-Pacific nations on organ transplantation. The meeting was chaired by the Chinese Vice Minister of Health, Dr. Huang Jiafu. And China's country presentation was delivered by a Deputy Director General for the Chinese Ministry of Health, Dr. Meng Chun. In his presentation, Dr. Meng gives detailed statistics on the total number of transplants performed in China, post-operative survival rates, and the number of hospitals performing transplants. This is a direct contradiction of China's 2007 claim that no Chinese authority has compiled official statistics on organ transplants.
I mean, it was a blatant misrepresentation of what they themselves were doing, and as I said, could only be credible to somebody who was not paying any attention to the issue whatsoever and used the Chinese response as their sole source of information.
We decided to call the Chinese Ministry of Health in Beijing to see if they would tell us the number of transplants. And to help, we brought in someone with experience dealing with Chinese officials, Dr. Wenyi Wang. Posing as an editor of a Chinese medical journal, she asks officials from China's Ministry of Health to give her the total number of transplants.
I said, it's just simply, you don't know? And he said, I know of, but I cannot give out. I said, this is strange because in the United States and Europe, and this number is publishable. And then they said, yes, I know, but not here.
这个规定是怎么回事？那有没有个地方我去自己找？
我不知道，别的地方有没有？
那你们这块要是不知道的话，那别人谁能知道啊？那部长办公室说你们
不是说我不知道，我说我不知道别的地方有没有。你刚才说不知道到别的地方找吗？我不知道别的地方哪地方有还有。现在我们这个地方呢，如果想要的话，应该等我们的领导回来才能给你答复。
Well, what you're dealing with a police state that lies. They simply lie and they conceal. And there are a lot of credulous outsiders who will accept that.
But without official statistics on organ transplants, it's difficult to verify one of the key findings of the Kilgore Mattis report. That the source of 41,500 transplants for the 6-year period from 2000 to 2005 is unexplained. But the Chinese government recently endorsed the data of the Hong Kong-based China Liver Transplant Registry. According to the registry's 2009 report, from 1999 to 2005, the number of liver transplants in China increased by 40 times, and 98% of them were cadaveric. The registry's report doesn't include data on other types of transplants. But if we consider that according to Dr. Meng's presentation, liver transplants accounted for about 10% of China's total transplant volume as of 2005. China's total transplant volume as of 2009 would be around 140,000. And considering the increase in transplant volume over the same period, the yearly totals after 2003 would be significantly greater than commonly held estimates of China's execution rate. So either China's execution rate must be significantly higher than previously thought, or Chinese hospitals must have found an alternative source. The numbers are one side of the story. Another side is the words and images of Chinese refugees. Ethan Gutman interviewed 50 Falun Gong refugees who had been through China's penal system. But he says what stood out most weren't the graphic descriptions of torture, but the occasional mention of a blood test.
They mentioned a physical exam. And one of them mentioned a physical exam that was very... She mentioned it. She was going to go on with her story. She wanted to talk about torture. She wanted to talk about her faith. But she started talking about this exam a little bit, and I asked her, well, you know, what did they look at? And she said they looked at my eyes, among other things. They had shined a light in her eye, clearly, you know, examining the health of the cornea. But they didn't do this. There was no peripheral vision test. There was no no light, nothing. No sense of actually checking brain function. It turned out that a lot of things hadn't happened. They didn't look at her genitals. They didn't look at anything. They didn't tap her knee to see if her reflexes were there. All they did was take blood tests, look at her eyes, feel around her kidneys, and do an electrocardiogram. I mean, this was, and the blood tests were sizable. Like 8 vials of blood. It became obvious after a series of these interviews this was definitely going on. Now, occasionally I'd have to throw out an interview, just literally say this didn't happen, because I felt the person was a little too eager to please me, didn't remember that well, might be sort of trying to remember things to... But most of these people didn't have any sense of where I was going with these questions. They honestly didn't. In fact, they always wanted to talk about something else. And I was always the one sort of bringing them back to this.
First, I was taken to the Harbin Public Security Hospital. This public security hospital was a military hospital, especially for the examination of inmates on death row. After I was taken there, I saw many Falun Gong practitioners, all male, in very good physical conditions, who were undergoing exams there. So after we saw each other, we realized we knew each other, and the police immediately separated all of us. First, they examined my kidneys, testing my blood, examining my liver, skin, and eyes. After the examinations, they diagnosed that my body was diseased.
Meanwhile, the World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong had organized teams to call Chinese hospitals. The callers posed as the relatives of patients needing transplants and asked the hospitals whether they could get organs from Falun Gong practitioners. They posted transcripts and recordings of their conversations online. But some critics suggested that the transcripts were not credible because of the secrecy surrounding the Chinese transplant industry. But in Phoenix TV's documentary, one doctor admitted that he had been interviewed.
他问我那边是不是用的是法轮功的那些器官，但是我告诉他，我说我并没有参与这方面的手术，不知道他们器官是怎么来的，这方面我没办法回答他。
In the documentary, Dr. Liu is given only a transcript of the interview, not the original recording. But NTD obtained the sound of the original over 10-minute-long telephone conversation, in which Dr. Liu tells a very different story.
说，就说你们以前用的，就说是从哪里找？是看守所还是到这个监狱呢？
监狱里面找的。
监狱里啊，他那种就是都是那种健康的法轮功是吧？健康的法轮功。
对，肯定是学得好的才能做完，因为这种东西做了要保证质量的。
那是都要像你们都要到监狱去自己去挑选是吧？
对，肯定挑选。
那挑选如果他不让你抽血怎么办？
他肯定会让的。
他怎么会让呢？
有法检在里面的，你怕什么？这东西都用不着你们担心的问题。他会
我知道，他知道会是给他这个取器官移植吗？他会知道吗？
不知道啊。
他不知道啊，就是那就不让他知道是吧？知道他就不让抽了是吧？
对。
那怎么说服让他说他说你抽血干什么？那你怎么讲呢？
哎呀，这个他们会有办法，这个不是你担心的问题。
The investigation into allegations of organ harvesting is the final chapter in the story of Falun Gong. But the story is still being written. Around the world, Falun Gong practitioners continue to use the media, the arts, and the internet to put pressure on the Chinese government and expose the persecution around the world. Inside China, Falun Gong practitioners also continue to peacefully resist the persecution by distributing printed materials, VCDs, or handmade crafts to promote Falun Gong and expose what goes on in China's prison system. In 7 years, Falun Gong had gone from being virtually unknown to having anywhere from 70 to 100 million followers. Each now has a story of repression and terror. Right now, those stories are buried beneath a sea of propaganda, an internet blockade, and the threat of persecution. But, one by one, as those stories are uncovered and told, the first 10 years of the 21st century will forever be remembered as Falun Gong's decade of courage.